I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower Podcast, we will be exploring U.S. China AI competition. How does China's approach to AI development compare to that of the United States? What role does open source versus closed source AI play in shaping diffusion and security concerns? How have recent developments in AI, including the rise of DeepSeek and China's shifting policy towards private sector innovation, impacted China's technology trajectory? To explore these questions, we're joined by Dr. Jeffrey Ding, the author of the book, Technology and the Rise of Great Powers: How Diffusion Shapes Economic Competition. Dr. Jeffrey Ding is an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University. Previously, he was postdoctoral fellow at Stanford Centers for International Security and Cooperation, sponsored by Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. His research has been published or is forthcoming at European Journal of International Security, Foreign Affairs, Review of International Political Economy and Security Studies, and his work has been cited in the Washington Post, the Financial Times, and other outlets. He also writes a weekly newsletter which features translations of Chinese conversations about AI development. Dr. Ding holds a PhD in International Relations from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. Jeff, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Bonnie, for having me.
So I'd like to start by asking you why you wrote your book, Technology and the Rise of Great Powers: How Diffusion Shapes Economic Competition. What drove you to write this book, and what were some of the main arguments that your book finds, and how does that shape conventional thinking about this issue?
Yeah, I think the main motivation for me to write this book came from my frustration and also my confusion about what the nature and shape of U.S. China competition in emerging technologies like AI actually looked like. And there was so much hype and speculation and sound and fury about the US and China locked in this geopolitical high-stakes competition over artificial intelligence. But I didn't feel like there was any coherent framework about trying to figure out what we were actually competing over and what were the key factors that mattered for this competition. And so that drove me to write this book, Technology and the Rise of Great Powers, which looks at past technological revolutions and how they affected the rise and fall of great powers, to draw lessons from these historical cases, to hopefully shed some insights about present-day U.S.-China competition in artificial intelligence. The main takeaway from the book is, contrary to conventional wisdom, that great power competition in these past industrial revolutions is about which country monopolizes leading-edge innovations. Actually, technological leadership is about which country can spread these general-purpose technologies across an entire population of users within their economy and achieve widespread productivity growth. So that's the takeaway of the book in a nutshell.
And how does your finding then contradict what you characterize as your frustration with the current conversation about U.S.-China competition?
I think if you take even just a random sample of newspaper articles, blogs, white papers, government documents, books about present-day U.S.-China competition in artificial intelligence or any other emerging technology, I would say maybe 90% of the analysis is focused on which country can develop the next greatest breakthrough first. Who can come up with that foundational breakthrough, right? The next DeepSeek R1 model or the next OpenAI's ChatGPT platform. And the book is saying it's not necessarily about leadership in cutting-edge innovation. In the past, the technologies that mattered most were these general-purpose technologies, like AI has the potential to be, like in the past, the role played by electricity, the computer, the steam engine. And here, competition among great powers was more about which country was able to transfer and spread and diffuse those frontier innovations from their top firms and their top labs to the entire economy, including those small-sized, medium-sized businesses to adopt and implement these general-purpose technologies. And that's crucial to this widespread productivity growth that drives shifts in economic leadership.
Typically, as you looked at various historical case studies, how long has it taken for new technologies to diffuse across society and lead to significant productivity boost?
That's one of the main takeaways from the book, which is There's this regular pattern by which general purpose technologies often take multiple decades from their arrival to the ultimate diffusion throughout countless application sectors in different areas of the economy. In the case of electricity, it took 4 decades from the initial emergence of the electric dynamo to economy-wide impacts on productivity growth in the United States, which was the earliest adopting country. And so that is one of the important trends that we see with general purpose technologies is they require this prolonged period of diffusion, in part because you need all these different application sectors to reorient their organizational practices, to upgrade their human capital, to make structural changes in order to accommodate a general purpose technology like AI or electricity.
I do want to follow up on artificial intelligence as a general purpose technology. But before that, I wanted to get your thoughts on how do you see PRC leaders view your argument and how do they view AI in that context? Do they view artificial intelligence, for example, as something that China needs to dominate and monopolize leading edge innovation? Or are they also relatively supportive of your argument that they need to diffuse AI throughout their society and throughout their economy?
I don't think it's necessarily a view unique to Chinese leadership. I think all countries, all governments are very much biased towards the innovation-centric approach just because it is the conventional wisdom. And naturally, humans gravitate towards that initial moment of innovation, the eureka moment. In our media coverage, not just in Chinese media, but English language media, there's this gravitation towards the heroic inventors, the technologists that grace all the front pages of the Wall Street Journal or MIT Tech Review. And so I don't think it's unique to Chinese leadership, but I do think Chinese policymakers have also prioritized this leading sector innovation-centric view of technological competition. And that's why you see in a lot of the strategic plans, it's about making China the innovation center in AI, or it's about trying to ensure self-sufficiency in different aspects of the AI supply chain. We see this with Chinese leadership consistently setting ambitious cutting-edge R&D targets and meeting those, whereas a more diffusion-centric approach might prioritize broad-based education and technical education and STEM education. China has been much less ambitious about those education targets and much less consistent in meeting those education targets. In some, I think there is that bias and preoccupation with the leading sector innovation-centric model.
You mentioned earlier that electricity was an example of a prior general purpose technology that led to significant changes and industrial revolution. How does artificial intelligence compare to electricity and these other prior technologies? And in this day and age, where things are moving a lot faster than before, is it still reasonable to assume that it will take decades for AI to diffuse across society?
I think one of the ways to distinguish a general purpose technology from a technology that's not a GPT is to look at the pervasiveness by which it can diffuse across the entire economy. I think one way to distinguish between the more enabling nature of AI compared to some other emerging technology that is also on the front lines or one of the flashpoints of U.S. China tech competition, say electric vehicles, is that advances in electric vehicles are not fundamentally transforming what's happening in the domain of AI. But advances in artificial intelligence are completely transforming the field of electric vehicles with autonomous driving assistance and all these different AI-enabled features. And so one technology is just more enabling, more foundational than the other. One technology is more general purpose than the other. A few indicators that show AI as a candidate to be that next general purpose technology. In the book, in the last chapter, I cite a few statistics in terms of the diversity of technology classes, the diversity of technology sectors in the job posting data, in machine learning related postings, the diversity of the technology classes in the patents that cite machine learning patents is greater than the patents that cite blockchain patents, for example, or biotechnology patents. So that's another indicator of one technology domain being more general purpose than the other. Now, to the second part of your question, it seems like everything's moving faster nowadays. Why wouldn't we expect diffusion to happen faster? Well, I think one thing to note here is that a reasonable time to date the emergence of this current general purpose technology is with the AlexNet submission to Stanford's ImageNet competition, which set off this new paradigm of deep learning. That happened back in 2012. So 1 decade has already passed. That's one important fact to set the table with. And I think oftentimes we overestimate how quickly things spread. A lot of people were making the same arguments with computers. But for a long time, we kept saying we see the computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And it just took time for organizations to adapt, for countries to build up the necessary human capital to take advantage of these general purpose technologies. Think about something like Microsoft Excel, right? How many people can actually use the conditional formatting feature, which is really crucial to actually productively use Microsoft Excel. Even these things that seem very easy to adopt can be difficult and take a lot of time.
Jeff, given how long you said it takes for AI to be adopted and that it's already been a decade, how do you view current U.S. and China's ability to adopt to AI, as well as what do you view as current U.S. and PRC AI adoption rates?
It's a good question. I think in the book, I argue that the US is much better positioned to adopt AI at scale than China. In the book, I focus on institutions for skill formation, so education and training institutions that can widen the base of engineering skills that are connected to a general purpose technology. And so I compared the number of universities in the US and China that met a certain quality baseline, which was a low quality baseline for training AI engineering talent, which was this university had at least one researcher who had published in an established AI conference. And China had 29 of those universities, whereas the US had 159. And so once you get past the Peking universities of the world, the Tsinghuas, the Nanjings in China, the bench in the US is much deeper and broader in terms of training average AI engineers. And so that's a case for the US being better positioned to spread and embed AI across a wide range of productive processes, not just in the internet industry, not just in the AI industry, but in the construction sector or in the education sector, in different service sectors. I think it's very early still in terms of adoption statistics. To the second part of your question, we may have some survey data. I think Reuters' Breaking View recently showed some data that integration of AI was still higher in the US compared to Chinese counterpart firms. I think one useful metric that I'm tracking is how many companies actually use a certain amount of computing tokens a day in terms of calling a large language model and integrating a large language model into their productive processes. And that number, I think, is still relatively low for China. It's only a little bit over 200 companies that have met that threshold of using 1 billion tokens per day. And I think that roughly correlates to having 1,000 conversations a day. I don't have the comparable metrics for the US, but I would guess that number is much higher in the US. All of that is to say, it's still early days in terms of tracking the widespread implementation and integration of AI into productive processes.
Jeff, if I recall correctly, I saw in your book you had a statistic from a couple years ago in which you mentioned that the AI adoption rate in the United States was still in the single digits. Is that still the case?
So that was a survey module by the U.S. Census Bureau. It's a little bit outdated by now. I think the data came from 2019, but it was a survey of all firms in the U.S. economy, where only single-digit percentage of firms had said they had either implemented machine learning advances or even trialed them in their operations. Maybe that we don't have updated data. The Census Bureau has not done that module again in more recent years. But I think the key thing there is the population of potential firms that can adopt AI is the entire economy. And so it's not surprising to have very low rates of adoption, especially early on in the trajectory of a GPT, because it's just much harder to diffuse a technology when the entire population of users is so large. Contrast that with other sectors like pharmaceuticals or electric vehicles. The users are just the sector itself. It doesn't need to spread to the education sector. It doesn't need to spread to the manufacturing sector. So the adoption challenges are not as difficult.
And are you also looking at how each government has adopted AI in terms of its government policies? or how the government governs society. One thing that I think has gotten quite a bit of attention has been China's use of various surveillance technologies with different AI components in it to monitor its citizens. And we're also hearing from the two sessions a desire to use AI and other technologies to improve agriculture. It just seems like the Chinese government is quite interested in using artificial intelligence in a variety of ways. Have you also been tracking that?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point in that government procurement can sometimes function as a source of anchoring demand for a new technology, and that can push further diffusion. We've seen that in the past with the US's military demand for semiconductors as anchoring and pushing forward and promoting the development of semiconductors in the US. Some people have pointed to a similar trend with the Chinese Ministry of Public Security and local level public security bureaus providing that source of anchoring demand, that stable source of procurement for surveillance applications of computer vision technologies. I think for me, the question there is, I don't see the Chinese government's ability to more precisely monitor and surveil its population as this type of economy-wide productivity boosting development that a general purpose technology promises, right? It doesn't resonate with me that this supercharged surveillance capability is similar to the widespread electrification of an economy in terms of boosting everyone's productivity. In fact, in some ways, having a more supercharged surveillance system might depress productivity. In fact, when you look at all these computer vision companies and you look at all of their business statements and their prospectuses when they IPO, one of the key themes is we need to diversify away from becoming overly dependent on government applications and smart security applications. And we need to take advantage of AI as a general purpose technology with applications across all these different sectors. And so I don't see that as necessarily conducive to China having some advantage in diffusing AI as a general purpose technology. If anything, it might have even warped the trajectory of AI development towards serving a very narrow base of applications rather than a more widespread and broad-based trajectory like we would expect from a general purpose technology.
It seems like what you're saying is for artificial intelligence, there could be many uses. And one of the uses could be actually to potentially either dampen or have a negative impact on boosting development. But was that the case when you looked at other GPTs where they could be used in different ways and may not always contribute to, economic development as a whole?
I think the point there is initial government demand is not always necessary for the development of a general purpose technology. Other industries can serve as that anchoring source of demand. Yes, the U.S. Department of Defense played an important role in incubating semiconductors and the internet, but government actors didn't play a key role in incubating past general purpose technologies like electricity or machine tools, which I consider as part of a general purpose technology trajectory in terms of interchangeable parts manufacturing. It doesn't play a necessary role, and sometimes the government's involvement and the government's intervention can warp the trajectory of a general purpose technology towards a narrow set of applications that don't apply across the entire economy. For example, the government's demands for surveillance or certain military needs means the technology has to evolve in a certain way that prioritizes performance and stability and reliability over cost effectiveness, and that can actually dampen the spread of a GPT across commercial applications.
And in terms of diffusion of AI, one of the debates that we have both in the US and internationally is about open source versus closed source AI models. From your perspective, how does this debate intersect with diffusion? And to what extent does this debate matter in thinking about AI as a GPT?
One thing I want to clarify here is my perspective is relatively narrow. Even though I'm tackling a big question, how do technological revolutions affect the rise and fall of great powers? I'm looking at it through the lens of how did these industrial revolutions allow one country to sustain economic growth at higher rates than its rivals, with that being the key ingredient to economic leadership. And we know from history that the rise and fall of great power starts with a shift in the economic balance of power, and then that translates into geopolitical and military influence. So I want to be clear that a lot of the prescriptions and analysis that I've provided in this conversation is anchored in that specific context. In terms of debates over open source and closed source models, some of the arguments being made on this topic are coming at it from a very different context. People are concerned about the safety risks of artificial intelligence. Maybe some people are concerned about technological leakage, and open source applications can have dual use implications that can filter into military applications. And I think all those points are valid. But at least from the perspective I'm coming at it, in terms of optimizing for great power competition over economic leadership in general purpose technologies, to me, a lot of my prescriptions point towards whether the US can run faster in this competition with China. I think a mix of open source and closed source models and ensuring that there's a healthy ecosystem for different pathways of AI development is best attuned to that running faster, diffusing faster technology strategy.
And what are your thoughts on how the United States should run faster than China on artificial intelligence? So in addition to strengthening our capabilities, for example, should the United States restrict access to advanced AI models to China?
Yeah, for me, part of the answer to this question depends on where you assess the two countries currently and where you expect them to evolve in the near-term future. For me, my book states the US is in a very good position. It has a significant lead in that race. And so restrict planks will always have risks, right? They cut off economic interdependence, they impose a tax on citizens, they potentially can backfire, leading to China to develop self-sufficiency in some of these sectors. And so if you're already ahead, my prescription is the US should continue to invest in just running faster. This is the set of promote planks that we often grouped these strategies under the former Biden administration. And so a lot of the policy implications I draw out in the last chapter focus on widening the base of institutions that can train quality AI engineering talent, supporting alternative pathways such as through community colleges to more strongly cultivate that base of talent, encourage more private partnerships between U.S. institutions and industry to encourage the diffusion of AI technologies from frontier firms and universities to small and medium-sized firms in places where I grew up, like Iowa City, Iowa. I think that's my broader take on the U.S.'s current approach. I think we've over-indexed on this Fortress America. Let's prevent technology from leaking out. We've seen from these past industrial revolutions, you can't monopolize innovation in a field as broad as a general purpose technology, like electricity or AI. And it's going to be more about which country can run faster and improve its diffusion capacity in a general purpose technology.
Historically, when you looked at the prior industrial revolutions and prior GPTs, have leading countries tried to monopolize innovation? How long were they successful in doing so?
Yeah, I think in the first industrial revolution case, Britain tried to prevent its steam engine engineers from leaving Britain to go to the European continent. And it was very, very difficult to enforce. So I think across all of these different cases, governments do try to impose these restrictions, but very rarely were these the defining feature in terms of deciding who won out in technological leadership for each industrial revolution. When I went through the historical data, the defining feature was more about which country was able to develop education and training institutions that systematized and standardized engineering knowledge connected to a general purpose technology. Another example would be from the Second Industrial Revolution case. So this is 1870 to 1914. Germany is the country that's widely regarded as the innovation leader when it comes to pioneering new breakthroughs in the chemical industry, which is the most scientifically advanced industry at that time. So in some ways, it's the AI of that era or the quantum or nanotechnology of that era. And so the US is sending its best and brightest to German universities. Germany is winning all the Nobel Prizes in chemistry. It's producing most of the world's leading chemical research. And during this period, actually, Germany is turning more inward and imposing more restrictions on foreign students, worried about too many foreign students at their universities. So very much trying to cling to this notion of technological leadership founded on groundbreaking innovations. And actually what I found in this case was even though the US was very far from the frontier of scientific research in chemicals, the US actually led in cultivating a chemical engineering discipline in terms of developing standard methods of titration and crystallization and other chemicalization procedures that could apply across all these different industries, not just in synthetic dye foodstuffs, but in petroleum and food preservation in all these different industries. And so here, the US does not have a monopoly on innovation, but it's the leader in terms of taking advantage of chemicals because it's able to introduce chemical engineering and adopt and diffuse these practices across all these different sectors of the economy.
And then why did Germany's restrictions fail?
Well, I think even during that time, talent flows were already pretty globalized. So it was very hard for Germany to restrict chemical engineering knowledge or cutting edge research about chemicals from flowing out of its borders. So there, the key question is not, can you put a bottle on innovation? It's about, can you connect these innovations to industrial applications? And that's where Germany fell short.
Did you see Germany try to take any measures to restrict the physical acquisition of different types of chemicals?
There, the restrictions were, I think, restrictions on foreign students at German universities.
Let me turn to current events. The emergence of DeepSeek has drawn significant attention in the United States. And we also know that Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been meeting with private sector leaders, and he wants to provide more support for the private sector, particularly on the high-tech side.
How do you see these recent dynamics, and what does this mean for China's AI adoption as well as investments?
Yeah, let me say three things. Point number one is it's notable that the meetings with leadership happen after DeepSeek is already famous around the world. And so it's a signal here that what actually matters and what leads the way in China is really what private companies are doing and local governments are doing. And oftentimes the central government is trying to catch up. I think the second point I'll make here is let's differentiate actual integration and diffusion of AI into productive and efficient processes throughout the economy from publicity stunts. Eleanor Olcott in the Financial Times with a co-author had a great piece that said DeepSeek is being integrated and adopted by all these state-owned enterprises and hospitals. But there were some great nuggets in that piece that cited interviews from doctors saying a lot of times this so-called diffusion is just a publicity stunt. There's a real need to separate the hype from the reality in this area. Last point I'll make is when you're actually trying to separate out the publicity stunts from real world integration and efficient integration, in some ways there's a case to be made that US companies could eventually benefit more from diffusing DeepSeek across their productive processes than Chinese companies can. And so for my China AI newsletter, which translates Chinese writings on AI-related topics, one of my recent issues focused on third-party deployments of DeepSeek's R1 model. And this report that was published by a Chinese large language model benchmarking organization called SuperCLUE reviewed 18 different third-party deployments of DeepSeek R1. And so what I mean by that is a third party is a platform like Perplexity, which provides AI-powered search engine tools, but you can choose which model to run on Perplexity. And so you're offered the choice of using OpenAI's GPT-4 series or Anthropic's Claude series or DeepSeek's R1 model. This Chinese report on the stability and the effectiveness of 18 different third-party deployments of DeepSeek actually found that US companies had an advantage and were more stable and more effective in integrating DeepSeek's R1 services. And that included 3 California-based companies, Perplexity, Poe, and I believe Together.ai. And so those are 3 different ways at moving the debate forward on this front beyond just, look, the Chinese government is embracing DeepSeek. There was this press conference with Chinese leader Xi Jinping.
Jeff, you've talked quite a bit on what you described as the advantages that the United States has vis-a-vis China with respect to AI diffusion. What do you see as any of the key areas of strengths from the Chinese side?
I think when it comes to diffusion as a whole, China does have some advantages in certain areas. Like we've seen China achieve remarkably fast adoption of technologies like high-speed rail, consumer payments, things like food delivery apps. And I think the key characteristics there are for high-speed rail, you have a technology domain where the government can coordinate diffusion from the top down and can essentially mandate diffusion with constructing and investing massive resources into building infrastructure. In the case of some of these consumer-facing applications that have spread really quickly, here, there's not that much of a requirement on the human capital side. It's relatively costless in terms of diffusion, and you have such a large mobile ecosystem in a large market. And so there's capacity for fast diffusion in these areas. The crucial point here is that those two characteristics do not apply to a general purpose technology like artificial intelligence, or maybe like an enabling technology like cloud computing. We've seen Chinese adoption rates trail in those areas like cloud computing and industrial software. And there the difference is this is not something you can mandate from the top down. You have to get the small, medium-sized business to actually think that, hey, this makes sense from a profit-making perspective for me to adopt DeepSeek or whatever AI innovation into my normal business operations. It's also not something that's costless in terms of all these consumer-facing apps. Businesses need to potentially have an AI engineer with good training to be able to fine-tune a particular model and tailor it for their specific industry data set. And so there are some advantages China has when it comes to the diffusion of different technologies, but I don't think they necessarily translate to something like a general purpose technology.
Great, thank you. One final question for you as we look forward. What should the United States be doing differently, if anything, to maintain our leadership in artificial intelligence and emerging technologies? I think you were suggesting earlier that we should focus more on diffusion instead of restricting the technology flows. Is there anything else that you wanted to add here, or were there any other recommendations you want to highlight from your book?
Yeah, I think the main point I want to make here is oftentimes we think of technology policy as only about investing in cutting-edge R&D or restrict tight planks in terms of preventing technological leakage, protecting intellectual property. And I think at its heart, the book is arguing that effective technology policy can also be education policy. That education policy is a form of industrial policy, especially if the technology you're targeting is a general purpose technology. The book is really saying we need to invest in the education institutions, whether they be community colleges or research universities or even certification companies that provide training in machine learning and support alternative pathways to talent upgrading. We need to invest in all of those education institutions. I think that's my takeaway. Right now, it's pretty clear, just given the news, that the current administration is very much treating education institutions as the enemy. One of the main takeaways from the book is they are actually the linchpin for why the U.S. has been the technology leader over more than a century. And so education policy as strategic industrial and technology policy, I think, is the takeaway I want to land on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff, for joining me to discuss your book, to share your main findings from the book, but also ways in your book challenges conventional wisdom, both in the United States and China, about how to think about artificial intelligence as well as the diffusion of that and the extent to which artificial intelligence and other general purpose technologies have led to industrial revolutions. Really appreciate all your insights today.
Thanks, Bonnie, for having me.